The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
The range of seamless unison doubling between flutes and piccolos is narrow, and should be carefully scored. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss. We see piccolo and flute scored on the same written pitches all the time, resulting in sounding octaves. But what about those occasions in which both instruments are scored in unison on the same sounding pitches? As I discussed in a tip long ago, in 100 orchestration tips about woodwind auxiliary changeovers, sometimes it's better to score wind parts with the player holding on to their auxiliary instrument, rather than changing back to the standard model for a brief passage, if the intended pitches on the standard instrument are just as easily played on the auxiliary. Nowhere is this rule of thumb more anticipated in great orchestration of the past than with the treatment of piccolo parts. Piccolos are often scored in unison with flutes, not just octaves, but doubling on the same pitch. This helps the piccolo player in terms of convenience, but does it help the texture of the orchestration? The honest truth is that piccolo-flute unisons have a narrow range of seamless unison doubling, and are never truly balanced to perfection. An orchestrator can score such parts together without really harming the texture, but they need to be aware of the consequences of such an approach. Certain well-laid plans may come to nothing, while other unintended effects may arise, for better or worse. First, let's look at the combined ranges of piccolo and standard flute, for strengths and weaknesses of register on overlapping notes. As every orchestrator should know, an auxiliary instrument is almost always a copy of its standard model. Every quirk of fingering, overblowing approach, and strength of register on the standard instrument is usually duplicated higher or lower. The piccolo represents a copy of the C flute one octave higher, usually minus its low C and C-sharp extension keys, and abandoning the top D as being a non-musical tone. In this chart, we see that the piccolo and standard flute overlap only 2 octaves, D5 to D7 in concert pitch, reading down an octave in piccolo parts. Simply put, this represents the top 2 octaves of C flute and the bottom 2 octaves of the piccolo. But as we observe from comparing the characteristics of their individual registers, this doubling cannot be balanced throughout on all pitches at all dynamic levels. The ideal pitches for unisons are actually around the range of a perfect fifth, from around sounding C6 to G6. Most of the piccolo's breathy first octave is far too delicate to compete with the flute's stronger, clearer tone in its second octave. In this passage, Tchaikovsky goes as low as a unison concert G-sharp 5 in his Romeo and Juliet Fantasy Overture. But admittedly, this is more for cohesion of line and continued engagement of the player than for actual added strength. The piccolo will add very little power to notes lower than written C5, but the rest of the passage will work fine as a triple unison of all flute family members. In other phrases from the same overture, Tchaikovsky scores flute and piccolo unisons as low as concert F5 or E-sharp 5, but he must have known that the piccolo would add very little to the notes at the beginning of this passage. Further on, though, starting a phrase in less than audible circumstances and then running up to higher notes is something that will work fine with piccolo in unison with flutes, just as both flutes themselves do this in their weaker register a bar earlier in unison with both clarinets. Above concert G6, the piccolo's written G5, the tables are turned. The piccolo gains greater and greater strength of projection and timbral keenness, which some orchestration manuals refer to as shrillness, and the standard flutes can do little but add some tone weight up to C7 and maybe even D7. It's doubtful whether such doubling is all that effective above B-flat 6, though. In its high register, the piccolo sparkles with energy and nuance, whereas the flutist must use consistent pressure with fewer and fewer dynamic variations as they approach D7. The end result is that this unison will work so long as the music is committed to a fortissimo dynamic, and the composer is resigned to what will quite likely be an uneven, somewhat phased tone from the combination of players, if exposed. In some examples from Uranus, in Holst's Planets, flute and piccolo doubling work all the way up to a concert B6, as all the instruments are playing very loudly. It's a powerful sound, but as mentioned before, it has very little finesse. Of course, all these concerns are ameliorated to a degree with combinations of unison flutes and piccolo doubling a soaring string melody. In that case, all bets are off, with the caveat that the piccolo's uniquely cutting edge will become more and more prominent above its written C6, concert C7. But it's rarely necessary to reach so high to make that kind of musical point. Speaking of which, let's finish off this tip by reading through the full score to that section of Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony that I showed at the beginning. Notice how the piccolo is used to thicken up the flutes in support of the first violins over and over. Perhaps its weaker tone is being used to temper that of the two C flutes in Tchaikovsky's mind, and then in the end gives him that higher range when he gets to the octave doubling. Have a listen and decide for yourself. Then I'll see you at the end of the month with a look at a great new orchestration text.